This monster killed her with a pepper grinder. Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of Leigh Jennings. Viewer discretion is advised. Leigh Jennings was born on May 14th, 1944, and she grew up in Florence, Kentucky. But eventually she would move out to Aurora, Indiana. Leigh was a mother and a grandmother. And just a few months before this case occurred, she became a great-grandmother. And everybody loved her. Leigh was a very spiritual woman, a very positive type energy, and she greatly influenced a lot of people in a very positive way. People described her as very warm, very inviting, and just all around a really lovely woman. And what happened to her was just so brutal. This was Leigh's home in Aurora, Indiana. On April 5th, 2012, Leigh's body was found inside her home. It was a brutal attack. She had been bludgeoned to death. Eventually, they learned that she had been struck several times with a skillet, and then she was beaten to death with this large pepper grinder. It was an unbelievably savage attack. Leigh, who was 67 years old at the time of her death, was not very trusting of banks, and so she kept most of her cash in safes inside of her home. And it turns out that cash had been missing. In one of the safes, however, was a note. It was like a promissory note, and it was about a loan to a man named Charles Stephenson. He had been friends or acquaintances with Leigh. So they looked into him. They discovered that he had called Leigh's house and also was exchanging text messages with her sometime around March 29th. They then discovered that Leigh had loaned him money, and he knew where her money was kept. On March 30th, he actually goes into one of the people he owes money to and gives them $1,000 in cash. Money they can confirm he did not have just a couple of days prior. He says he borrowed it from a friend named John, but John said, no, he didn't. On May 9th, 2012, they go to Charles' home and they find him on his bed covered in blood. He had attempted to end his own life, but failed. There was a suicide note that basically stated how much in debt he was, but he did not kill Leigh. In an interesting little twist, this here is Charles Stephenson's aunt and uncle, Peggy and William Stephenson. They too were murdered inside their home in 2011, and their nephew Charles Stephenson was a suspect in their murders. There was DNA found at their crime scene, however, that did not match Charles. And police don't consider him a viable suspect in their murders, but there are some people who believe he may still have been involved. There was DNA found on the pepper grinder and on the skillet used to kill Leigh. DNA that would come back to matching Charles Stephenson. They also found a fingerprint in a location that it should not have been if he wasn't there. So he is arrested and he's charged with Leigh Jennings' murder. He goes on trial for murder and for robbery because that was his motive, robbery, and he is found guilty. And he is sentenced to life in prison without parole. And Leigh got the justice she rightfully deserved.